Woodrow Wilson. However, before we can really look at Woodrow Wilson as the President of the United States, we have to rewind back to the election of 1912 just a little bit more and look at progressivism. So the thing is, up till this point, when we've talked about the progressive era and we're looking at progressive presidents and everything at this time period, we've been looking at the Republican Party. But progressivism wasn't just a Republican phenomenon. Actually, when you look at it, Democrats more consistently supported these kinds of reforms than Republicans did at this time. And so this brings us to Woodrow Wilson, who was currently the governor of New Jersey. The thing is, Woodrow Wilson's going to combine things like he very much was publicly eloquent, but he also had a cold personality, and he was able to balance this kind of self-righteousness that led to a stubborn inflexibility that actually really led to intense and expedient compromise. Was not someone you didn't want to get along with, basically. He was seen before he became the governor of New Jersey as really conservative in the Democratic Party, and he had actually been picked by New Jersey Democrats to head off the progressive candidate going for governor. But once he became the actual governor of New Jersey, he would go on to champion all of those popular reforms. And he basically put himself in the position as campaigning as the progressive in the party's presidential nominee come 1912. Now, that being said, when you say that, oh, Woodrow Wilson is a progressive and Teddy Roosevelt is a progressive, their progressivism was very different. So Teddy Roosevelt, TR, labeled here, his progressivism was known as New Nationalism. So this was very much things like having a powerful government state and getting involved when it was of national interest. And so we've seen that with, like the coal strike and everything like that. He also supported things like social welfare, workers' compensation, and the abolishment of child labor. Now, Woodrow Wilson's form of progressivism was known as New Freedom. And a lot of this comes as the idea of the freedom to compete. So it's looking at a lot of like capitalist ideologies. So he wanted basically the government to regulate competition, but more so break up like monopolies through antitrust actions. So he wanted things like, let's prevent high tariffs, because high tariffs he saw as blocking like free enterprise. Let's, break up big businesses and regulate them to a certain extent so that they have the freedom to compete. So anything dealing with like social welfare, Woodrow Wilson sees as reaching beyond the proper scope of the federal government. So this brings us back to the election of 1912 that we already know that Woodrow Wilson, and as you can see in this, is clearly going to win. Now, some other things about it I wanted to mention is like Teddy Roosevelt, he is actually going to attract a lot of women with his social legislation. However, keep in mind this is 1912. Women don't get the vote until 1920. The thing is, Teddy Roosevelt had this like personal popularity, but he was basically doomed to defeat with the split of the Republican Party. You also have to keep in mind there are people who wanted to go even further into the progressive agenda, and so it's going to be things like a lot of voters are going to actually embrace Socialist Party candidate Eugene V. Debs, and while he doesn't get any of the Electoral College, he actually got 6% of the popular vote. Now Wilson, as you can see here, he easily wins with the Electoral College, even though he only had 42% of the popular vote, whereas Teddy Roosevelt came in second and Taft came in third. The other thing to keep in mind with this election is that the Democrats are also going to gain control of Congress with it. So, how is Woodrow Wilson going to implement his progressive ideas? So he is going to go on to propose a full legislative program, and he is going to work to secure its approval just like Teddy Roosevelt had done. He had regular conferences with Democratic leaders. He also did things like install a private telephone line between the Capitol and the White House so he could personally keep tabs on congressional actions. So we have all those 400 messages from Teddy Roosevelt. Now we have a private telephone line. Woodrow Wilson's also going to manage to implement what he wants through like appealing to the public for support, but also he was good at playing politics and getting patronage, and he was able to compromise with conservatives. So the first thing that he implements is going to be trying to reduce that high protective tariff, because that's seen as like a sign of special privileges for industry. So lowering it, that causes, more competition and freedom of competition, thus new freedom. Anyway, this is actually going to be the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of 1913. And this actually was the first substantial reduction when it comes to tariffs in the United States since the Civil War. The other thing is, if he's limiting tariffs, you have to keep in mind that means the government's not making money from those tariffs anymore. And so basically, to compensate for these lower tariff rates, Woodrow Wilson's also going to levy the first income tax under that 16th Amendment that actually passed when Taft was president. Next thing that he does is he wants to reform the nation's banking. So he wanted to basically balance the demands. On one side, you have the agrarian progressives that basically wanted the government to control all the banks. And then the other side would be bankers who wanted private control. And so what Woodrow Wilson is going to set up is the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This is going to make 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, but these banks are actually privately controlled, but then they were supervised by the Federal Reserve Board, which is appointed by the president. So we see that regulation, and you can see how this is a compromise between private ownership and government control. This would lead to a more flexible national currency and improve access to credit. The third thing he puts forward is legislation to break up monopolies. However, it's less about breaking up monopolies, and it's more about opting for regulation of these monopolies. He's going to endorse the creation of the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission. This was supposed to oversee business activity and basically prevent any kind of illegal restriction on competition. So once again, that regulatory role. And this actually probably was more along the lines of what Teddy Roosevelt had wanted originally and everything. But a lot of supporters of Woodrow Wilson were actually disappointed by it, because basically the FTC is going to lead to a partnership between these trusts and the government, and really the trusts are going to dominate in this partnership. And actually by like the 1920s, the FTC is virtually a junior partner in the business community. The thing is, after he does all of this, Woodrow Wilson announces no further reform is necessary. He's done. Which shows just the limited nature to Woodrow Wilson's ideals of reform. He is refusing to support women's suffrage. He killed any legislation that would have abolished like child labor or expanded credit to farmers. And think about all of those problems that we were seeing farmers facing previously. In fact, Woodrow Wilson's going to support the introduction of racial segregation within the government itself. He resegregates the White House. And the employees that complained about it were just fired. Keep in mind that kind of goes back to, remember his racial prejudice with when we were looking at him with imperialism and everything. The thing is, this brings us up to the presidential election of 1916. Republicans, by this point, are no longer split, and Woodrow Wilson needs more followers. So he's going to abandon all of that opposition to social and economic reforms. When it comes to farmers, he would convince Congress to pass the Federal Farm Loan Act, which actually he had rejected twice previously before this point. This Federal Farm Loan Act provided farmers with federally financed long-term agriculture credits. Then you get, for rural areas, the Warehouse Act of 1916. This basically was funds to construct and improve rural roads through the adoption of basically dollar matching principles. When it comes to labor interests, we get the Keaton-Owen Act. This prohibited the interstate shipment of products made by child labor. So you can still use child labor, but now you can't go across state lines with items that were made by child labor. He also would go on to avert a railroad strike in 1916 by helping pass the Adamson Act. This established an 8-hour working day for railroad workers. Then you get things like the Kern-McGillicuddy Act, that was basically a workers' compensation system for federal employees. Because if you think about it, if you're setting up things like workers' compensation systems in the federal government, other businesses might follow suit after. Another thing that he does is actually this picture here. When it came to the Supreme Court, he is going to nominate Louis Brandeis, who was known as basically the people's lawyer at this time. The thing is, this outraged a lot of conservatives because Louis Brandeis was Jewish. And you got to remember all of the anti-Semitism of this time period. Now, despite there being a vicious campaign against Louis Brandeis, Woodrow Wilson's going to manage to secure Brandeis's confirmation. This basically consolidates the reformers behind him who are going to vote for him, and he is going to, spoilers, win the election of 1916. There's a little bit more to it when we get into World War I, though. But before we get into that, I ask you this question. Looking at these three presidents, thinking about them in imperialism, thinking about them when it comes to progressivism, which of the three presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, do you think was the most modern president? And why do you think that?